Father Real was one of the most genial and kindly of the missionaries, and he surprised all those who had thought that every one of the fathers was severe. He saw no harm in walking out among the young people and saying friendly things to them. He was often known to go with young men on moonlight rides, lassoing grizzly bears or chasing deer on the plain. His own horse was one of the best ever seen in the valley, and the father wore a scarlet silk sash around his waist under the Franciscan habit. Guadalupe Vallejo. Father José María de Refugio Suárez de Real was the most unworthy priest that has desecrated the cloth in California. James Alonso Forbes. If you're familiar with my podcast, you're probably aware that one of my gripes or pet peeves about how California history is perceived is that it's done in such a simplistic way. I've been interviewed on media from NPR to local public television stations to Univision regarding topics about California history. And one of the things I'm always trying to do is to bring on some nuance, some context, because I think that that's what gets left out most of the time when we talk about California history. Now, this makes sense in a lot of ways because most people, if they've grown up in California, learned about the history of their state in fourth grade and then probably stopped learning after that. And then there are people who know a whole lot, experts like the people I've interviewed in this show, whose knowledge is so advanced that, it comes from a place of great specialization. So there's not a lot of people in the middle who really understand a lot about it. And so what I'm trying to do is to share the different layers and complexities and interesting stories about California history, because I think they need to be shared. So what I want to do here today is to talk a little bit about a person that I've researched, and I'll probably spread it over a number of different episodes, but who kind of shows how complex and contradictory the people who populated the story of California, especially in the early days, were. He is a Franciscan missionary. His name was Father José María Suárez del Real. Now, you may have heard of him because during the era of the ranchos, the era of secularization, when the mission chain was sort of dismantled, he was in charge of a number of missions, including Mission San Carlos at Carmel, Santa Clara, San Jose, and others. He was also in charge of going up to Sonoma at a certain point. So he played an important role, and he was also a missionary present in California during the U.S. occupation and up through the annexation and statehood of California. So I want to talk a little bit about him today to try and give you some background to this person and this period of time, which was so tumultuous for the people who were living in California at that time. In fact, the story begins in June of 1832, when 9 young Franciscan missionaries from the College of Our Lady of Guadalupe of Zacatecas in Mexico arrived in Tepic in the state of Sinaloa. They were about to board a ship to take them to the port of Monterey in Alta California, and there they were expected to take charge of several missions. Now, all of these men had been born in the Americas, and almost all of them born in New Spain, which later became Mexico. They probably were expecting to go and take over. Well, I don't know. I don't know what kind of idea they had, but they were probably expecting to do more or less the same type of work that their predecessors had done in Alta California, that is Spanish-born missionaries. There's oversee missions with native people, with communities of native people on them, etc. But little did they know that when they actually arrived, things would be kind of upside down. Their very identity as Franciscans and missionaries would be challenged in a way that the Spanish-born missionaries hadn't experienced. So Father Real, as he was known, was born in 1804 in New Spain. I'm not sure exactly where. It's something I'm working on. And then he had been ordained a Franciscan priest in 1831. Made his vows as a Franciscan at the College of Zacatecas in 1828. Now, why was he coming to Alta California? Well, in 1827 and again in 1829, the newly independent Mexican federal government declared the expulsion of almost all the Spaniards residing in the Republic of Mexico. So lay people, priests, religious, nuns, were all, if they were born in Spain, they were expected to return to Spain. Of course, that was easier said than done, especially in Alta California, where basically all of the clergy were Spanish-born. In any case, a number of them did leave, like Father Antonio Peri, Mission San Luis Rey, who we talked about with Elena Hazelton. So there were vacancies. There were spots, especially in Northern California, where they did not have priests to minister either to the natives or also to the Hispanic population. So what happened was the Mexican government decided to ask the College of Zacatecas to send missionaries. So what does that mean? A college or colegio in this circumstance is a place where missionaries were trained, where priests, friars were trained to become missionaries. So, for example, Father Junipero Serra had been trained, and most of the Spanish Franciscans in Alta California had been trained at the College of San Fernando in Mexico City. And most of them were Spanish. They spent several years learning, training to be a missionary. If you listen to the talk with Jeremy Beer about Father Garces, he talked a lot about their training and how rigorous it was. In any case, what the Mexican government was looking for was a college, a colegio, who had Mexican-born Franciscans, priests who were not born in Spain, but were born in Mexico. And so the College of Our Lady of Guadalupe of Zacatecas had them. So they were tasked with going and replacing the Spanish Franciscans who had left in Alta California. Now, while they were waiting for their vessel to leave, another member joined the trip, and that was a man named José Figueroa. José Figueroa had been governor of the territories of Sonora and Sinaloa in Mexico, and he was now being sent to Alta California to take over as governor there. And he was being tasked with the secularization, the dismantling of the mission system, okay? So it was almost ironic that he's traveling, Figueroa is traveling on this ship going to Alta California with a bunch of missionaries who are going to be sent to missions that are actually going to be devolved into something else. So this idea of secularization, which I spoke about in an earlier episode, was that the missions as native communities were meant to be actually become towns. The mission community would become a pueblo, a town, and the missionaries themselves would be replaced with clergymen who were what they call secular. That is, they weren't part of a religious order. They were attached to a parish, right? And the parish and the village would be self-supporting and pay taxes as well. That's another thing that the Spanish crown wanted. So that was a goal that they had set already during Spanish times. But it never came about because the Franciscans would always object that the native people were not ready to be sort of transformed into Spanish citizens yet. And so they needed to still live under the regime of the missions. Now, the previous governor of Alta California, José María de Chandía, had already decreed that the missions would be secularized in 1831. But it didn't happen, or he moved a lot more slowly because Father Narciso Duran, who was the president of the California missions at the time, Franciscan, really objected. And for that precise reason, he felt that not only were the native people not ready, but he felt that secularizing the missions would actually leave the whole thing open to unscrupulous people who would try and take advantage and just get a hold of the mission properties and use them for cheap labor. So it hadn't really happened except for one or two missions in Southern California. Now, Figueroa was determined to actually make it happen, but he had been warned by the Mexican government to proceed in a very prudent and slow way. They eventually arrived in Alta California in early of 1833, all of them. In fact, the ship had to stop early on at Cabo San Lucas. That was the journey was really difficult. There were a lot of storms, and there were even mutinies aboard the ship. So when they stopped in Cabo San Lucas, Father José Real, and his brother Antonio, he had a brother who was also a Franciscan priest coming to Alta California. They actually got off the ship and went overland. So when they arrived there, José de Real's first assignment was Mission San Carlos Borromeo, which is on the Carmel River and was the place that had been the headquarters of Junipero Serra. And he's buried there, as you know. But when Real arrived there, it was in very bad shape. If you were to go to Carmel, the mission at Carmel today, it's been very beautifully restored. But at that time, it was really already kind of falling apart. And this is 1833, but a couple of years later in 1835, they were even taking the tiles off of the mission church to build the city hall. So it was a difficult time to arrive in Alta California. And the times had been difficult for already a couple of decades. Francisco Garcia Diego, who was one of the priests that accompanied Father Real, eventually was made the father prefect of the missionaries, wrote a letter at one point saying that the demands since 1810 on the missionaries and the missions and the Indians have been so much that it has been devastating. And in fact, what he was complaining about was it seemed that the missions were only producing goods for the military, for the presidios. And this is something we've talked about before, that after 1810, with the struggles in Mexico over independence, supply ships stopped coming from Mexico, New Spain, to Alta California to resupply the presidios. And so it fell to the missions to help maintain the presidios. This caused a lot of discontent among Native people, contributed to a lot of Native people running away. And not only that, but revolts like the 1824 Chumash revolt that we spoke about with Dr. John Johnson. So this was a very difficult time. And not only that, but when soon after Father Real arrived, Governor Figueroa published his decree to secularize the missions, that is, to appoint administrators, civilian administrators, to oversee them and to redistribute the lands and the goods, including the real estate of the missions, the buildings, all of their supplies, tools, etc. So Real was ordered to work with this administrator, José Joaquín Gómez was his name, to draw up an inventory of the mission property, supplies, and livestock, and then to sort of make an appraisal of the total value. The final document was 39 pages long, but this led to something that was also very difficult for Real and the other Franciscans. Once they made this appraisal, once they did the inventory of the properties, then those properties could be sold off or, redistributed amongst the Indians. Some of them were, not all, but none of the proceeds of those transactions would go to the Franciscans. Now, the Franciscans, of course, lived at the missions previously, and as such, they lived off of the produce of the missions, right? So none of those proceeds now would go to the Franciscans, and effectively, they no longer had any income. So he was basically told, you don't have any income, you don't have any means of support, now figure it out for yourself. So that is where he wound up in just 1 year after arriving in Alta California. And it wasn't just Father Real, but almost all of them. And the problem was here that not only was the mission no longer a way for them to be supported, but there was an idea that, then the local Californios, the local settlers, would tithe, that is, give a portion of their earnings to the church in order to support the missionaries. Well, that was not a practice that ever took hold in Alta California, right? And so almost nobody was giving any money to support the church, to support the missionaries. And so not only was he living in a dilapidated mission and now the property had been taken away, but there was no means of support, no income, no tithing, no donations. So he found himself in a very difficult position, so much so that Father Francisco Garcia Diego, who I mentioned before, the father prefect of the Zacatecan missionaries in California, wrote letters to Governor Figueroa, and you can find these letters in the archives. And he said, and I quote, "The ministers of religion," as the priests, "should be respected by men, and they should have the means to subsist and to conduct divine worship," Garcia said. He said, "And if the faithful do not provide this, that is, the means to subsist, to which end they are bound, that is, they're supposed to support their priests, we cannot be held responsible for the spiritual tasks to which we are bound." In other words, if they don't support us, we don't have a way to go minister to them. So this was the situation into which these men came, and Father Real in particular. I'm going to stop there. We'll talk more about what happened to him later and what happened to these guys and how the later events of California history affected them and how they impacted those events. And I think you're going to find it very interesting. But for now, think about this time period in California's history and how things changed. So we'll be talking more about this, so stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California history teachers which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code podcast, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.